It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here today on behalf of the Institute of International Relations to hear the lecture by Professor Timothy Snyder on the past and future of nation-states and their role in shaping Europe's future. History should not be just a matter of arcane discussions, but should be effective in shaping our political life. We need to know our history and her rhymes. Tim Snyder places history in our sight, too often narrowed by excessive dwelling on the present. Sometimes he does so brutally, as in Bloodlands, but always as a true public intellectual, in a way that is accessible, yet far from banal or superficial. His analysis is sober, but it speaks to our own history as a political nation, very modern, as no doubt he will say, if only we are willing to listen. When he warns that most of the power of authoritarianism is freely given, we know too well what he speaks about, or we should. When he invites us to take responsibility for our lives to prevent the modern authoritarian's creeping ascent, we may be reminded that the notions of care and responsibility are key to the fabric of our modern liberal thought. It's therefore my great pleasure and privilege to welcome Tim Snyder here today, and it is no less my privilege and pleasure to now invite Tomáš Petříček, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic, to deliver his opening remarks on this wonderful occasion.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and guests. Dobrý večer všem. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all at the premises of the Czerny Palace, the seat of the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, on a very special occasion. Tonight we have a rare opportunity of hosting a lecture of one of the leading historians and intellectuals of our time, Mr. Timothy Snyder. His presence here today is both topical and symbolical. As you know, we are going through dynamic and turbulent developments in international relations and diplomacy. The world is more connected, more contested, and more complex. To use the words of the EU global strategy, conventional ways of thinking about international relations are under strain. We face fundamental global challenges. To understand them and to design efficient responses, understanding our own history is indispensable. A few days ago, we have commemorated the centenary of the end of the First World War and of the foundation of independent Czechoslovakia. One of the consequences of the Great War was the emergence of nation-states in Central and Eastern Europe. For many nations of our region, it represented the culmination of their quest for self-determination. Liberation from what they viewed as domination and oppression by multinational empires. Yet we might also argue that it is ceded countless grievances that were 20 years later resulted in the outbreak of the worst and bloodiest conflict that our world has ever witnessed. And paradoxically, as if history repeated itself, one of the crucial challenges to freedom and democracy nowadays is the danger of growing nationalism and populism around Europe. Timothy Snyder is one of the few thinkers of today capable of understanding and explaining those issues in a very broad context of our civilization. He's also one of the few who can write about them in an extremely attractive way, yet with a very human touch. And as I read with my breath kept his books, I really recommend to those who hasn't to read them, because this is the history we should never remember and never forget. That is why we look forward to listening to his ideas that will surely provide us with the necessary food for thought in terms of thinking of our policy, our actions, our deeds, ourselves. I remain also hopeful that Professor Snyder will be able to answer your questions and react to your comments after his expose. Ondřej Dietrich, the director of Institute of International Relations in Prague, kindly agreed to moderate the subsequent debate. But before I give a floor to Professor Snyder, I would like to say a few words about the Institute of Humanities in Vienna also. And then I would like to invite Ms. Shalina Randeria, director of the Institute, thanks to whom we have Professor Snyder here with us today to say a few words of welcome as well. Institute for Human Sciences is one of the most prestigious institutes in the field of human sciences in our region. It plays a unique role in Central Europe as an intellectual hub where people discuss international issues. I'm honored that the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs belongs to one of the long-term partners of the Institute. The lecture of Professor Snyder today, followed by his public debate at the Charles University tomorrow, is only the first outcome of our collaboration. I hope that such collaboration will continue through equally remarkable events in the upcoming years. Now I have an honor to invite Ms. Shalina Randeria to the floor, please.
Honorable Minister, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to extend a few words of welcome, but more than words of welcome from Vienna on behalf of the IWM. What I would like to do is to use the occasion to extend a few words of gratitude to several people who are in the room here, because of whose untiring efforts and support to us, this event and our program with you has been possible. I'm very conscious of the fact I stand between you and Tim Snyder, so this is going to be very brief, but it's important for me to be able to express our gratitude on this occasion. It's wonderful to be in the Chenin Palace for the first time in my case, and to admire this magnificent building. I would like to just extend my thanks for a continuous support over many years to the ministry, which we have intensified in 2017 with a new program which brings us fellowships from the Czech Republic for young and for senior scholars to come to Vienna and to continue their research with us, but also to intensify the connections between the Czech Republic and the Institute through bringing some of our scholars here. And I'm very happy that Tim Snyder has agreed to open this series of lectures, which we hope to hold here annually. So this intensifies the cooperation both with the Foreign Ministry and between the Foreign Ministry and the IWM. But we have had as an institution a very long history of relationships with the Czech Republic, and let me just mention 2 or 3 things for those of you who don't know the Institute well, but I do hope some of you will visit us in the near future and see the Institute for yourselves. In the 35 years of its existence, the Institute has not only had a number of Czech scholars visiting us here in Vienna, who have been at our conferences, workshops, who have stayed with us as translators, as scholars, have conducted their research in our premises, in our library, but we have hosted for several years the Patočka Archives, which was established already, as some of you may know, in 1984, with the goal to preserve copies of Jan Patočka's writings and manuscripts which were smuggled out of your country at a time when his work was indexed in communist Czechoslovakia. This was the beginning of a cooperation then with what became the Patočka Archives in Prague, and which could only become official in 1989 here. In that framework, in Vienna, the Institute established the Patočka Memorial Lecture. It's our annual signature lecture, at which we've had it almost 30 years now. We started in 1987, and we've had Jacques Derrida, Leszek Kolakowski, Nancy Fraser, and most recently Chantal Mouffe giving this very prestigious lecture in Vienna honoring the name of Jan Patočka. My very personal warm thanks to Minister Tomáš Petříček for having not only graced the occasion today, but also for opening the event today, and for your warm words of welcome to me personally and to my institution. I would like to thank Dr. David Král, who is Director of the Department for Foreign Policy Analysis and Planning and is in charge of the cooperation with us, as well as Dr. Ondřej Dietrich, who is Director of the Institute of International Relations and has also been a great support in organizing the program this evening. But before I close, a warm thanks to three people without whom this evening and our cooperation would not have been possible. Mr. Jiří Čickecký, who is Deputy Secretary, Department Director of the Foreign Ministry, who initiated the cooperation with us, and it was with his support that we were able to sign the Memorandum of Agreement. A very warm special thanks to His Excellency, the former Foreign Minister, Mr. Lubomir Zaorálek, who is also here with us this evening, and who was crucial in cementing this intense program with us. Last but not least, a very warm thanks to His Excellency Karl Knezh Schwarzenberg, who served as a Czech foreign minister, but for us, equally importantly, he has been a long-term friend of the Institute for Human Sciences right since its very foundation. So he is a bridge between us in Vienna as well. Thank you very much for coming this evening, and I hope that we will see you on further occasions. Without much further ado, let me give the word to Tim Snyder, who is permanent fellow at the IWM, and thank you very much for opening this lecture series. I think this is the beginning of a very fruitful intellectual exchange that we begin this evening. Thank you so much.
Minister Petříček, Minister Zaorálek, Minister Schwarzenberg. It's a pleasure to have all three of you lined up here in the front row. We owe a debt of gratitude to you, and I mean that sincerely. The relationship between the Institute for Human Sciences and Czechoslovakia and then the Czech Republic is one of I think, of a profound philosophical and moral character. Without Jan Patočka, the Institute does not exist. The occasion for the creation of the Institute of Human Sciences was the preservation of the intellectual and ethical legacy of Jan Patočka. The institutional way that we begin is with the Patočka archive. So it's symbolic, but also quite touching for me, for us to be able to return to Prague in this way, 35 years later. Our founding director, Professor Krzysztof Michalski, was Jan Patočka's student in Warsaw in the early 1970s, when there was no one to teach phenomenology. Michalski, the young Michalski, turned to Patočka, and they wrote to each other, first in Polish and Czech, and then later in German. And thanks to Patočka, Michalski exists. Michalski becomes a philosopher. Michalski eventually founds this institute. So without Czech philosophy, without the history of Czech thought, without Czech dissidents, we do not exist. So when we express our thanks, we're expressing not only our appreciation for the particular program of cooperation, we're also acknowledging a debt which for us is profound and which is real. So it was very touching for me to see our rector of today, Professor Shalini Randeria, return to Prague, to this place, to speak to you. So thank you very much for these warm words of welcome. I look forward to the discussion with Ondřej Dietrich. I'm going to spend the next 40 minutes or so speaking to you about the problem at hand, which is the nation state and Europe. Let me start with the news of the day, which is Brexit. What is actually happening with Brexit? What does Brexit actually mean? Krzysztof Michalski, when he remembered Jan Patočka, one of the things he liked to remember was, Patočka says the thing about responsibility is that you carry it with you everywhere. The most striking thing about the debate over Brexit, and indeed about discussions over the European Union, is the titanic absence of responsibility. From a historian's point of view, an absence of responsibility about the most basic historical facts of the European 20th century. What do I have in mind? Here's what I have in mind. The debate about Brexit, and by extension, the debate about the nation state in Europe, starts from a premise which is entirely false. The debate about Brexit began from the premise that there is such a thing as Great Britain, that there is a nation state called Great Britain, and that this nation state could either stay in the European Union or leave the European Union. From a historian's point of view, the very odd thing about this debate is that there is obviously no nation state called Great Britain. There has never been a nation state called Great Britain. There was a British Empire, and as that British Empire collapsed in the 1960s, 70s, that entity, or the metropole of the British Empire, the islands in northwestern Europe, joined something which were then called the European communities. In other words, there is not a millisecond in the history of modern Europe in which there was a Great Britain that was neither imperial nor European. It simply never happened. If Brexit takes place, then there will be a Great Britain, which will be a nation state until it falls apart. Because here's the thing, insofar as there is a history of the European nation state, it is a history of fragility, and it is often a history of failure. Let me think about this historically. If you ask about the history of the nation state from 1918 to 2018, you immediately run up against a problem, which is that in Europe, most of the important countries were not nation states during that time. If you want a history of the nation state in Europe, you actually have to go back another 100 years, and you have to move south and a bit east of here into the Balkans. The true history of the European nation state is a history of Greece, and a history of Serbia, and then a history of Romania, a history of Bulgaria. These are the places which actually were nation states. But here's the interesting thing. The whole idea of the nation state, as it emerged in the Balkans in the 19th century, was a copy of a non-existent original. So the idea of a Greece or a Serbia or a Bulgaria or Romania was that in the Balkans, we are going to copy the nation states that exist in the West. But there were no nation states in the West at the time. There were empires. And those empires, when they looked at the Balkan nation states, of course did not see them as fully sovereign entities. The empires looked at the Balkan nation states as parts of themselves. From the point of view of London or Petersburg, or later Berlin, the nation states of the Balkans were not fully sovereign, they were not equal. They were puppets, they were clients, they were parts of our empire. So, how does that story proceed? It proceeds in a very interesting way. The nation states of Europe, the true, original, authentic nation states of Europe, the Balkan nation states, react to this problem in a very interesting way. They react to it with nationalism of a particular kind. What they do is they say, well, we are small, we're not fully sovereign, we have agrarian economies. How do we react? What you do is you say, if we could only have a bit more territory, then we would be stronger. And so the thing that we call ethnic nationalism emerges. You argue that just on the other side of that river, that hillside, that mountain range, there are more Serbs or more Romanians, it doesn't matter which, more Bulgarians, more Macedonians, more Montenegrins, take your pick. And therefore, in order to restore our ethnic boundaries, we must take that territory. At the same time, you are thinking, if we can only take that territory, our agrarian economy will be stronger. We'll be able to raise more taxes. And so the 19th century Balkan nation states were created and emerged and in fact established the history of what we think of as militarism. They spent a huge amount of their budgets on the military. They borrowed huge amounts of money, especially Serbia from France, to fund the military. And what did those nation states do with that military? They destroyed the world order. In the Balkan War of 1912, these tiny European nation states, which no one took seriously, drove the Ottoman Empire from Europe, something which was never supposed to happen. More seriously, in 1914, these tiny European nation states, one of them in particular, Serbia, provoked the war that we remember as the First World War. The European nation states destroyed the world order in 1914 to 1918. So this should give us pause when we think of this period that we're now describing, because by the time this period even begins in 1918, we have about a century of the history of the European nation state, the logical development of which was to destroy the world order as it was known in the 19th century. Which brings us to the interesting way that European history emerges in the 20th century, what I think of as the accident of Europe. The great accident of Europe is this. The First World War destroys some empires and not others. So remember, empire is still the relevant category. Until 1918, Europe is a Europe of empire, and the world is a world of empire. The most important thing about world history in 1918 is that that is the moment by which time European power touches all the continents and basically every square kilometer of the entire face of the earth, if you include America as a European power. Right? So what happens in 1918 is an accident. Some empires are destroyed and some empires remain. And this accident is what forms the entire shape of the 20th century and which creates the opportunity for the next creation of nation states. Which empires win? The maritime empires. Britain, France, with some qualifications, the United States. Which empires lose? The land empires. The Ottoman Empire, Prussia, the Habsburg monarchy, and the Russian Empire also loses in the sense that it breaks apart during the war. And so you have this enormous coincidence. The empires that lose are the ones that control territory in Europe and Asia, contiguous territory. The empires that win are the ones who have maritime empires. This means that in the history of Europe in the 20th century, there are two parallel tracks of the history of decolonization, which only meet up late in the century. One track of decolonization is the history of Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, the new nation states that are created in Europe after the First World War. The other track of decolonization is slower and more distant. It happens after the Second World War. So this imperial context is incredibly significant because it reminds us of what the real alternatives in European history are. The real alternatives in European history, as we know it, are empire and integration. Why do I say that? I say that for reasons that you know very well, and this is my next point, that the history of these new nation states is very brief. Interwar Czechoslovakia lasted for 2 decades. Interwar Poland for 2 decades. Interwar Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, 2 decades. If you ask historians or just citizens of these countries why this happened, they will give very special national answers. Czechs and Slovaks will talk about Munich, Poles will talk about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Austrians, I forgot Austrians, will talk about Anschluss. But isn't it interesting that every single new national state created by the Paris peace settlements of 1918 and thereafter, every single one of them ceases to exist in 2 decades? Is that simply a coincidence? Can we really explain the fact that every single one of them was destroyed with these specific national stories? I think the answer is no. I think something much more systematic is at play here. And to get to this, I want to talk for a minute about the weaknesses of the interwar states that we can observe, because these weaknesses are actually still with us today. And if we can identify them in the 1920s and 1930s, it helps us a bit to see what the European Union does now for the state. So what were these weaknesses? The first weakness was no big trade area. Whether you like empires or not, you have to acknowledge that empires provide a big trade zone. Breaking up empires means very small zones of free trade. This is extremely relevant for the second problem, which is the peasant question. With the exception of Bohemia, the entirety of Eastern Europe was a zone of peasant populations and therefore peasant politics. What do peasants care about? The ability to sell at market. When can they sell at market? When their country has access to a big international trade zone, which is precisely what the interwar East European states did not have. Which leads us directly to the third problem, which is Germany and German power, and Germany as an exporter, Germany as an exporting power. What did German export power mean in this part of the world in the 1930s? It meant that Germany could extend a series of deals in Danubian and Balkan Europe, according to which East European states sold their grain to Germany, peasants sold their agricultural production to Germany, and Germany in exchange sold manufactured goods. By way of this very simple economic mechanism, Germany brought much of Eastern Europe into its orbit and under its power well before the Second World War began. In that sense, Anschluss, Munich, and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact are not the beginning of the story, they're the end of the story. Because by that time, Hungary and much of the Balkans were in effect already under German economic control. But remember those 3 abstract problems: peasant politics, trade zones, German power, because those are still, I would say, if not the central, major political problems of East European countries today. So, after these states fail, you know what happens. They become part of the Soviet Empire. So it's a very interesting point. It's a very interesting point to make. Not only do all of the new states formed after 1918 fail, but the entire territory of Eastern Europe, governed by these treaties, with the exception of Austria, governed by these treaties, then falls under Soviet domination, which I would say is a sign not of the success of the nation state, but rather of the continuation of empire, now empire of a different form. Okay. This brings us to Western Europe. The history of Europe from 1949 to 1989 can be seen in 2 different ways. And what I want to suggest is these 2 different ways come together in a fashion that we tend not to see. One way to see the history of Europe from 1949 to 1989 is as the Cold War. 1949 to 1989 means Soviet-backed communist takeovers. It means Soviet tanks in Budapest in 1956. It means the Prague Spring of 1968. It means the normalization of the 1970s. And then finally, it means the Velvet Revolution at the end of communism in 1989. That's one story. That's the story of Eastern Europe. But from the point of view of Western Europe, something entirely different is taking place, at least entirely different at first glance, and that is decolonization. Remember those maritime empires, those empires of the sea? They also win the Second World War, but after the Second World War, they lose their colonies. In Eastern Europe, this is invisible. In Eastern Europe, who cares? If you're in Hungary in 1956, you're concerned about Soviet tanks on the streets, you're not concerned about British impotence in Egypt, right? If you're in Prague in 1968, you're concerned about Warsaw Pact tanks in the streets. You're not concerned about the French loss of power in Southeast Asia. But these things are happening at the same time. What's happening in Western Europe is that the big maritime powers, the French, the Dutch, the British, the Portuguese, and the Spanish, over those very same 4 decades, are losing their empires. And what do they do when they lose their empires? This is the magical thing. When the big European empires lose their maritime possessions, they have a place to come back to. And that place that they come back to is called Europe. This is how Europe is created. Europe is created as a place for the metropoles of the former maritime empires to land. Europe is where you go if you are a traditional West European maritime power and you've lost a whole series of colonial wars. It's important to see that this is the origin and not the Second World War. I know that you've been told 1,000,000 times until you believe it that what happened in Europe was that Europeans learned from the Second World War that war was bad and therefore you started cooperating economically. Not true. I can't stop you from hearing that another 1,000,000 times, as you will, probably from this very podium where I'm now standing. But for the purposes of responsibility and truth, I'm just going to tell you that that is a myth. What happens in the Second World War is something different and special, and it's the beginning of a very different trend. The Second World War is, the meaning of the Second World War is Europeans try to carry out colonial policies inside Europe itself. That's the meaning of the Second World War. As, by the way, observers from beyond Europe who were alert to global history, people like Frantz Fanon or Aimé Césaire, noted at the time. The meaning of the Second World War is that a great European power, Germany, brought colonial methods of war to Europe itself. The German attack on Poland and the German attack on Soviet Union proceeded along very specific colonial lines. We do not recognize that these are legally existing states. We do not recognize that their peoples have any political or civil rights. That was new in Europe, but it was not new to Europeans. It was traditional European colonial practice elsewhere in the world. Why am I stressing this fact? Is it to make the Germans feel worse than they already do? That would be a perfectly acceptable side effect. But I'm making the point for an intellectual reason. The intellectual reason is this. The Second World War is the first important example of Europeans losing a major colonial war. When Germany loses the Second World War, that is the beginning of the trend of Europeans losing colonial wars. And by the way, for the same reasons. When Hitler invades the Soviet Union, he categorizes the Soviets as colonial peoples. He imagines that the Germans will have huge institutional, technological, and intellectual advantages, which they in fact don't have. And that's how decolonization proceeds in the rest of the world as well. Peoples who had been controlled by Europeans copy European institutions and technologies, and the gaps in institutional and technological capacity which made empire possible slowly disappear. Europeans then lose colonial wars, right? So the way to understand the Second World War is not as the time when Europeans learned that war was bad. I can press this point further if you want. I mean, if you still think it's true, consider the following. The people who suffered during the Second World War were in this order: the Jews, the Belarusians, the Poles, and the Russians. Ask yourself, are those the 4 most peaceful nations you can think of? Right? I'll leave it to you to sort out which order you prefer, right? But those are the peoples who actually suffered during the Second World War. Are they all pacifists now? Are your best Polish friends the best pacifists you know? Are your best Russian friends the best pacifists you know? So the notion of learning from the Second World War is a myth, and it's connected to a bigger myth, which I'm going to return to. So what it really is the example of this larger trend. European empires the maritime ones are now going to fall apart. When Germany begins economic discussions with France and with Benelux, this is the beginning of a trend, because the Belgians and the French and later everyone else are going to lose their empires too. And Europe is where they are all going to land. So the history of the European Union is an annex to the history of decolonization. Now, you're asking yourself, why aren't we taught this at schools? I know that's what you're asking yourself. Just humor me, pretend that this is what you are asking yourself. There is one historian who made this argument very articulately, and it was Tony Judt, a favorite of Minister Zaoralek, in his book Post-War. The reason that you're not taught this in school is because the European Union is an alibi. If you tell the story of the European Union as a story of wise European nations learning from war in Europe, that war is bad, then you don't have to go into the history of European colonialism or empire at all, as you generally don't, right? If you believe that there's something called a French nation state, or a Dutch nation state, or a British nation state, then you can tell the story of a nation state which learns from events in Europe. The whole fable of the wise nation, this whole story that there were nation states that learned from war, allows you to emerge from the 20th century with something like a clean conscience. Sure, we had the most destructive war in the history of mankind, but at least we learned the right lessons from it. No, you didn't. No, you didn't. Those lessons were never learned. A different lesson was learned. That lesson was, when you lose your political and military hold on world markets, returning to Europe is an existential necessity. And that's what happened. And that's your inheritance. It's not as morally exciting, but it's a very good inheritance to remember, because it's that inheritance which is now at stake. Not a moral one, but an existential one. Because think about it. If the West European nation states were never nation states, what is the debate about returning to the nation state really about? You can't return to something which has never existed. This brings me to 1989. The remarkable thing about the history of the European Union, in my view, is that the European Union brings together two different kinds of post-imperial fragments. It first brought together metropolitan fragments: London, The Hague, Paris, capitals of far-reaching empires. Then, after 1989, and to be specific, in 2004, 2007, and 2013, the European Union brought together imperial peripheral fragments. East European countries, which had been on the edges of European land empires: Habsburg, Russian, Ottoman, Soviet. The remarkable thing about the European Union is that it contains metropolitan and peripheral fragments of former empires. I know that's not the most flattering descriptions of your states, but I'm trying to follow Patočka's prescription to be responsible. So that's the achievement of the European Union. It provided a place to go, not just for the Dutch, the French, the British, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and so on. It also provided a place to go for the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Hungarians, and the Poles. And the interesting thing, for those of you who, like me, lived through the 1980s, or who studied the 1980s, the interesting thing is that there was a time when the East Europeans understood all of this perfectly well. In the 1980s, Czech dissidents, the most interesting and important of them, but this was also a completely typical view, didn't talk about the return to the nation state. Czech dissidents talked, to the point of cliché, about the return to Europe, right? Navrat k Evropě. That's what they talked about, return to Europe. And there was a reason for that, which was that in the 1980s, the memories of 1968 and 1938 were fresh enough that every sensible Czech and Slovak was perfectly aware that the state was not going to be sufficient unto itself. The state, although it was a worthy goal and one worth sacrificing for, and many people sacrificed quite courageously, that the state could never be an end in itself, that the state would need to be connected to some higher form of politics, which leads to the very interesting spectacle of the early 1990s. Some of you took part in these discussions, but I'll remind all of you of them because they have this very interesting character. Today we talk about the enlargement of the European Union. That is a basically false way to think about things. The European Union did not enlarge. The European Union was dragged kicking and screaming into negotiations that it did not want with a whole series of East European countries, including Czechoslovakia. The European Union was not a being which was trying to get bigger. On the contrary, in 1991, 1992, at the time of Maastricht, what European diplomats in London, doesn't matter, The Hague, Paris, said was, we're done. History's over. This is as far as it's ever going to go. We have created our European Union. We're very pleased with ourselves, and that's it. Those of you who took part in the East European negotiations of the time, right? This I know is shocking for those of you who have grown up and like married somebody from Erasmus. But at the time, oh, it's more of you than I thought. I guess that explains all the hand-holding. And the Italians who are kind of looking off vaguely, okay. As I talk about Eastern Europe. So at the time, what happened was not that the European Union enlarged. On the contrary, the European Union made it very clear in the early 90s that it was not interested in the membership of Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. The European Union only after great pain was persuaded to enter into extremely unequal and protectionist association agreements in 1993, which did not even contain the promise of future membership. The reason why the European Union enlarged was not that there was a European Union that wanted to enlarge. The reason why the European Union enlarged was because there were sovereign states called Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and so on, where there was a consensus that joining the European Union is an existential necessity, that it's a necessity for the existence of the nation and the state. That, in my view, was the correct historical understanding. Now that one is inside the European Union, whether in Eastern Europe or in Western Europe, it's very easy to forget what the European Union is for. Once you're inside, whether it's West or East, you forget that this was an existential decision. Once you're inside, you start telling yourself the story about how your nation is old and how it's wise and how it learned from war and so on. That's what everyone now says and thinks. This is a myth that it's important to get over. By the way, this helps us to understand pretty clearly what happened in Ukraine. So you are now all West Europeans in the sense that you now all take, you can correct me in question and answer. You now all take the European Union for granted. You all think that the Czech nation is old and wise and learned lessons and things. Being inside the European Union is being like inside any other relationship. It's very hard to understand from the inside. Your friends on the outside can look at you and say, But when you're inside the relationship, you don't know what you've got. Okay, that's to all you married couples out there. So who understands the European Union? The people who are just on the outside. So in the early 1990s, although your East European diplomats could not have recited a single line of the acquis communautaire, they understood in their bones that the European Union was there to protect the state. In 2013 and 2014, the crowds of students on the Maidan in Kiev also could not have recited a single paragraph of the acquis communautaire, but they knew in their bones, and they're right, that the purpose of the European Union is to protect the state. It's to make the state possible. When you Europeans and the West Europeans and all the Europeans looked at Ukraine, you saw many, many things, most of which weren't there. But one of the things that we failed to see collectively was this basic lesson of European history, which the Ukrainians themselves understood. The purpose of the European Union is to shore up the statehood of imperial fragments, which Ukraine is, which you are, which all of Europe is. The other people who understand this are another group of people who are on the edge of the European Union, namely the government of the Russian Federation. They understand that there is no history of the nation state. They understand that the alternatives are empire and integration. And that is why Russian foreign policy, which is incredibly intelligent and internally consistent, takes the line that you should all be nation states. This is why Russian foreign policy poses as the liberators of East European nations, because the Russians know perfectly well that the nation state never existed. This is why Russian foreign policy towards Brexit was exactly what it was: to encourage the British voter, by way of Twitter, RT, and other media, to think of Britain as a nation state that can make it on its own. This is why Russia supports AfD in Germany, the Front National in France, and Eurosceptics everywhere. Because the Russians are perfectly aware that in a world of nation states, they get to be the only empire. Which brings me back to the history of Czechoslovakia, and then to a final word about the European Union. Since we're sitting where we're sitting, and since the occasion for this lecture is what it is, I'd like to say just a word about how Tomáš Masaryk thought about Czechs and Slovaks and the sovereignty of the Czechoslovak state in 1918. Did Masaryk think that Czechoslovakia was an end in itself? No, of course not. Did Masaryk spend his whole life working for the creation of Czechoslovakia? No, of course not. He spent a couple of years doing so. Why? Because Masaryk's goal, as he said several times himself, was to find the political form which was most suitable to the prosperity, the decency, and the democracy of the Czech people. For most of Masaryk's lifetime, what was that? It was the Habsburg monarchy. Masaryk, of course, supported the Habsburg monarchy. When did Masaryk stop supporting the Habsburg monarchy? In the middle of the First World War. Why? Because by that point, it was clear that the Habsburg monarchy would cease to exist. And that the only thing, that the risk for the Czechs was at that point, that if the Germans win the war, Bohemia becomes a German satellite, right? That's the risk. And if the Germans lose the war and the Habsburg monarchy fragments, what happens then? Did Masaryk then want an ethnically pure, small Czech state? No. What did Masaryk and Beneš and all of their fellows try to create? They tried to recreate the Habsburg monarchy on as large a scale as possible. Interwar Czechoslovakia was not a nation state. Czechoslovakia, I'm not going to reveal any secrets now, Czechoslovakia was not a nation. Czechoslovakia, there was no majority population in Czechoslovakia, and that's how Masaryk intended it. He was not trying to liberate an ethnic nation from a repressive empire. He was looking for the best political solution for the people that he cared about, which were the Czechs, right? So what the purpose that the state serves depends on the geopolitics in which you find yourself. If the situation in which you find yourself is that an empire is falling apart, then you might create a state. The tragedy of interwar Europe of the period 1918 to 1938 is that there was then no place for Czechoslovakia to go. There was no higher politics at a European level which would help Czechoslovakia. You remember this as Zdrada, right? The French betray you, the British betray you, the Americans betray you. Fair enough. But what was really absent was any level of European politics which would have made the state normal. And because there was no such level of European politics, as soon as the Germans start pushing and the Soviets start pushing, the states go away. So this is what I wanted to say, and this is the conclusion of my lecture. What is the point of the European Union? Is the European Union some foreign, distant, exotic collection of bureaucrats whose only dream is to suck away the authentic, organic national life of the Czech people? Or Polish people, or Hungarian people, or Estonian people, French people? Or is the European Union the result of a series of existential choices made by post-imperial states whose elites, at least at a certain historical moment, were aware that it was an existential choice? Let's consider again the three basic problems of interwar statehood. Big trade zone. You didn't have it then. The European Union solves that. Peasant politics. The European Union solves that. Very specifically, the European Union is that historical form in which Germany gets to be an exporting power without conquering anybody at the same time. Right? Germany is an exporting power now, as it was an exporting power in the 1930s, but it doesn't have to conquer anybody. On the contrary, its elites can dream of nothing more than preserving the economic arrangements that they have right now. So what the European Union has done is to create the conditions in which the states which failed in the late 1930s don't have to fail now. They still can, of course. It can still fail. This is what history, of course, is about. I can do my best to explain to you what I think has actually happened in the last 100 years. But the good thing and the frightening thing about history, and again, this is Patočka who makes this point, the good thing and the frightening thing about history is that what happens in history partly depends on how we understand history and how we choose to take responsibility for the flow of history. So we're at a moment now where it's very easy for Europeans to say, Europe is something distant, the nation is something good, the nation can choose Europe or not. That's an inauthentic and, in my view, entirely false view of history, but it's very tempting. It's very tempting to say the nation is us and Europe is them. It's very tempting to say we've always been a good nation. It's very tempting. We've always existed. Very tempting proposition. But perhaps responsibility is on the side of doing something else. Perhaps responsibility is on the side of accepting a basic historical proposition, which is that what Europe has actually done is keep the European state going. And if we can start from there, of course that's not enough, but if we can start from there, if we can start from acknowledging how imperfect our own histories are, if we can start from acknowledging how needy the nation state is, if we can start from there, then we have some chance of thinking about a European future. Because if we start from the position that the nation state has always been there and it can choose Europe or not, we don't actually see the stakes of the conversation. If we understand that the nation state has almost never been there and that the longest period of state durability in modern Europe has been precisely within the framework of integration, then we can ask, aha, what can the state do for integration? What can we do to make it look like Europe has a future? That's where I'll leave you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the inspiring lecture. I will be a good moderator and I'll abuse my right to, or position to ask the first question. Now let's agree that the premise is that the nation state is, historically speaking, a modern fiction. Perhaps we can extend it even further and say that even the nation is a modern fiction. Dušan Třeštík, the late Czech historian, famously credited František Palacký, a 19th century historian, of inventing the Czech nation because he wrote the monumental history of the Czech people. He wrote it in German, by the way. But if we agree on the premise, then my question is, how come that this fiction, this utopia of the nation state, is successful? It is a compelling narrative for a lot of people today. So perhaps the nation state doesn't have a past, as you suggest, but for many people it has a future. And I guess we ought to understand why. So I would be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
So, I mean, let me start with a couple of clarifications. I don't actually think that the nation is a fiction. I think nations are real, like all relationships are real. In all relationships, there are stories that we tell to justify those relationships and find them that are in some sense wrong. But the nation as a set of relationships is certainly real. The Czech nation is certainly real. The Lithuanian nation is certainly real. I mean, it would take hours of clarification to say exactly what I mean, but I'm not denying that nations are socially real entities. What I'm denying is that the nation state has played an important role in European history. What I'm trying to say is that part of what makes the nation real is the lie that it tells itself about statehood. And much of the time, the lies we tell ourselves are not dangerous. But there come important points in every relationship, including the national relationship, where we can't tell ourselves lies anymore, where we have to face the way that things actually are. I happen to think that we're in such a moment right now. So I'm agreeing with you, I think, because I think it's very important for people to have a story about the past which explains the relationships in which they find themselves. I mean, a Czech who was born today and educated in the Czech school system is at some point going to realize that he or she is Czech. But did he or she have any choice about that? You know, not really. The Czech historical reality, the Czech discourse was there, so to speak, awaiting that child before that child even came into being. But is what the child learns in school going to be enough to keep the Czech nation going? No, right? No. And clearly what the British children learned in school was not enough to keep the British nation going. What I think as a historian is that the stories that nations tell themselves have a tendency to become narcissistic rather than reflective. They tend to leave out the very things that one needs to understand if we're going to keep ourselves going. In the case of the European nations, what's left out is, for the West Europeans, the history of empire, and for the East Europeans, it's very often the weaknesses, the internal weaknesses of the nation state in the 1920s and in the 1930s. So, of course, we're tempted by a story which says we've always been here and we always will be here. That's natural. I mean, but I think as reasonable human beings who want to create institutions, we can believe in the special character of our nation, right, with one part of our minds, and yet with the other part of our minds think, what does our special nation need to survive and to thrive and to prosper? Because a story isn't enough.
Okay. Now let us go to the Q&As. I see.
Thank you very much. I tried directly to say question. You said that European Union is something like existential choice, and this choice was made on both sides, on the West, on the East, but with different narratives. The West made this decision that is only possibility to create something, and the similar narrative was made on the East side, and with different legends. There are different narratives on both sides. And the question is if we are able to live together, East and the West, because of these differences. The differences are great, it seems, because it's this West, that is the history of colonial powers and imperias, but now we see different stories in Balkan, also in Central East Europe. And I'm asking this question because you mentioned this name, Tony Judd. And I remember his book, Grand Illusion, it was maybe in the 90s. And in this book, if I'm right, he is making some prognosis that it can't work. I would like to ask you, how do you see this prognosis of Tony Judd, that it's impossible to live together because probably these narratives are so different? What do you think about it?
I think one way to clarify the premise of your question, with which I completely agree, is to add Russia. So Russia has yet another narrative about the European Union. And the Russian narrative about the European Union is that we are going to reject this possibility. We're going to remain an empire, or we're going to become an empire. And that's very interesting and clarifying, because Russia is the first imperial successor state to, in effect, say, we're going to keep being an empire. I mean, what we can debate, whether Russia could or should join the European Union, under what conditions, and so on. But the interesting thing about Russian policy since about 2012 is that it's the first European state to say no to the European Union. All the other former empires have said, in effect, rather than talking about our lost colonies, we're going to pretend that we were European the whole time. Russia has made a different choice, and that choice helps us to clarify what we're talking about. Then you're right, the East European narrative is something different. The East European narrative is, or at least was, we were always good Europeans, but we were prevented from being good Europeans by the Germans and by the Russians, or by the Nazis, or by the Soviets. And now that we're free, we're going to show that we're good Europeans by returning to Europe. Whereas the West European narrative was rather, we learned from the Second World War that war was bad. But there is a similarity, which is the notion that we somehow learned from the horrors of the past. But you're right, there are differences, and I think you're also right that the narrative differences probably have to be reduced. I would not propose doing that by adding fiction to fiction. I mean, I have a very simple conservative response, which is that how about we have European history? How about we have a 100-page book of European history, which you all get taught throughout the European Union when you're in 4th grade? How about that? Why is that not possible? I mean, why is it when I teach European students, which I've been doing at Yale and also in Europe for a quarter century, why is it that I have to deal with 35 different national narratives? Why is that exactly? I mean, it seems kind of like a big mistake. So I agree with you. I think the only way over the long term, though, is to build a common European history, which is true. And where by truth, I mean including some of these larger issues like empire and anti-colonialism and Balkan history and things like this. So I agree with you. I mean, one of the tragedies, I think, of the last 25 years is that when we say history is over, one of the things we mean is we don't really take history seriously, and therefore, as a European Union, we leave the symbolic responsibilities to the nation states, to the member states. And I think that has real consequences, because we then, I mean, I'm sorry, a lot of you are very young, which is nice, but so you can be angry at me after I say this, but the problem with this is that you then raise a generation of Europeans who think history is not very important until there's some kind of crisis in Greece or in Ukraine. And then suddenly they think history is important, but what's activated in their minds are the various national myths that they learned a long time ago. And so then the past becomes a problem for European integration. I agree with you. I don't have any other answer than I think there really ought to be European history. I think European history would be good. Like Gandhi with Western civilization. It'd be good.
I guess the problem may not be that we don't learn history in school, but we don't learn how to use history critically. And some people do it. They mobilize history, these legends, myths, fiction, but they are very real in their effect, right? Now, I saw 2 hands over there, and I can't reach that far, but my colleague is going to give you the mic. Please ask them.
Good evening. Good evening. I'm Ondřej Houska, journalist with Hospodářské noviny newspaper here in Prague. You said that EU created conditions in which states don't have to fail. There is this notion of the European rescue of nation state, as is the title of a very influential book. But maybe somewhat paradoxically, you have both pro-Europeans and anti-Europeans in European member states saying that the EU has to go through fundamental reforms, and if not, it cannot survive, if it cannot work. Do you agree with this critique that the EU has to go through fundamental reforms, or is it just a myth politicians and elites are repeating? Thank you.
That reminds me of Minister Zaoralek's question, the part that I didn't answer. Tony Jett wrote a book called Grand Illusion, but then he later wrote a much longer book called Post-War. And as you know, in post-war, he's much more measured about, and indeed positive, about the European Union. And I think his view on the European Union was fairly similar to the one that I expressed, namely that it's imperfect, but it's a kind of politics of last resort for Europe. If we want to have the Europe that we're more or less familiar with, something like the European Union. It doesn't have to be this European Union, that's why I'm coming to your question. But something like the European Union is necessary to have a recognizable Europe after empire is done. Because, I mean, we shouldn't delude ourselves. The European history that's possible is possible largely because of empire. It's only national education which occludes this basic reality, right? But the John Stuart Mills and the Shakespeares and the Miltons and all the wonderful stuff that we have in European history all of it is in some fairly direct way connected to one kind of imperialism or another. And the only reason we don't see this is that we just choose to organize our history along national lines. And so the real question is, how do you have a recognizable Europe when there's no empire? That for me is the real question. And Tony Judt, I think this is one of the brilliant things that he got right, was that he wrote the history of decolonization and the history of European integration together, section by section, because I think this was his basic point. But of course, he's not the only one to make it in different ways. Mark Mazauer, Harold James have made this point, which brings me to your question. I'm not going to propose, I mean, I have ideas about how the European Union should change, but I'm just going to say in general, yes, of course the European Union has to reform, but not because it's crushing the nation state. The European Union should reform so that it can better support states, societies, human beings, right? But if you start the European reform process from the false premise that it's suffocating the nation state, then the reform that you get is not going to make any sense because you're starting from a place which is basically false. Of course, I think the European Union should change. I think for just a few examples, I think there should be a European Officer Academy. I think the European Parliament should be much, much more important, but that of course partly depends on European voters. I think the European Union is doing a very good job with climate. It's the only entity in the world that's doing a decent job with cyber, and it should keep on with those things. So one way to argue about the European Union reforming would be to start with, what is Europe doing better than the rest of the world? You could also start from there and say, oh, well, we're doing better than the rest of the world with privacy. We could do even better with privacy. There are various ways of thinking about reform. I agree with the idea that the European Union has to change, but I don't think the discussions should start with blackmail, right? I think Brexit honestly shows the insanity of that. The idea that the European Union has to change because Britain is going to leave otherwise is a nightmare for everybody. It frames the debate in exactly the wrong way, because it tells the British that they have this veto, and so the British are constantly unsatisfied, even though the European Union has been bending over backward to appease the British for its entire existence. And so if the starting point is you must reform because otherwise we go back to our rooms and cry, which is my definition of Brexit. If that's where you start the reform discussion, then you're going to end up in a weird place. But you might start the reform discussion with, hey, what is the European Union doing better than the United States? Or how is the European Union a modernization alternative to China? And how would we like to keep that modernization alternative distinct?
Okay, let's now take the question in the back, and then we will move to the second row.
Thank you. Thank you, Jakub Jirsa, Faculty of Arts, Charles University. You nicely described Europe as a place where the post-colonial powers come back or come home. I just wondered what would be your answer to Milan Kundera's rather skeptical claim in his article Tragedy of Central Europe that the Western Europe can hardly come back to itself when it basically lost itself exactly in the colonial wars and in the 60s and 70s. That if I remember right, his claim is that, well, Western Europe forgot about the central and eastern part, mainly because it lost its identity. So I wondered whether you have some kind of answer to this skeptical Kundera's claim. How can it come back to itself when it lost itself? Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I'm skeptical about that skepticism. You know, I'm skeptical about the whole. I'm very skeptical about the whole Kundera storytelling style of, you know, a Middle Europe that once existed but then lost itself, and then a Western Europe that once existed and then lost itself. I don't find that narrative arc very convincing, and much as I admire him as a novelist, I don't see any particular reason to take his diagnosis of French culture very seriously, one way or another. But I mean, to try to answer the question in a more positive way, I think French culture is amazingly dynamic in 2018. I think French culture was amazingly dynamic when Kundera first arrived in France. I think you know, the depth and richness of French culture is absolutely extraordinary. Neither as a historian nor as a human being am I able to define the moment when France was right, and therefore know when somehow France went wrong. I mean, from my perspective, looking at 2018 backwards, I just see this unbelievable richness. And the same is true, obviously, for German culture or for Polish culture or for any number of other European cultures. So I don't know what this. I mean, I don't know what it means to say that there was a culture that lost its way. I don't know what that means. I guess another thing I would say about this is that I think a lot of this is where I was trying to end. A lot of this discussion hangs on whether Europeans find a language to talk about the future. Because if the discussion is about the past, I mean, I'm a historian. They pay me to talk about the past. This is what I do. I like the past. I like to try to understand the past. And I think it's indispensable to understand the present and the future. But if the discussion about Europe is only about a kind of past, which is mythical anyway, in my view, then I think Europe loses out to the nations. Then I think the nations come back and Europe suffers. Because the nations are no good at talking about the future. Think about it. What is the future for Britain, for example, after Brexit? And we've had a couple years to think about this now. Think of an example of an English intellectual. When I say English for a reason, think of an example of an English intellectual who's written a wonderful essay in The Guardian or The New Statesman or whatever about the future of England after Brexit. How it's going to be great. Where is that vision, right? Where is it? It doesn't exist, and it can't exist. And that's not how the nationalists frame the argument. The nationalists are always going to frame the argument in terms of the British nation state, which never existed, right? Brexit is all about nostalgia for an empire, which existed but is never coming back, and which is treated as a nation state, which it never was. That's what the pro-Brexit argument is. But nobody on the left or right, as far as I can figure out, has any kind of argument for what the future of Britain is going to look like. So if the argument's about the past, everybody loses. The Europe loses first, and then the state loses second. So I think a very important thing is for us to get beyond the kind of literary, Bildungsroman or, these various literary arcs, and think about how Europe will look in the future, make arguments about how Europe provides a better future for Europeans than other possible alternatives would. And I mean, this for me is interesting about world politics in general, is the way that the future has just gone away. And I tend to think that the entities who first find the language to talk about the future again are going to be the ones who have some kind of advantage. Anyway, that's a long riff on your question.
Okay, thanks. Let's now go to the second row, and there are way too many hands. But there was a question in the second row, then on the other side, and then we'll see how much time we have left. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Valeria Karableva, Charles University. Thank you so much for your apt analysis. My question is about what should be changed in this theory for the 21st century, given all the recent shifts. Is it still valid that the choice is between empires and European integration, given that one of the consequences of these colonial losses of Europe is the peripheralization of Europe, right? So the world history is no longer European history, and there are many important players like former colonies outside of Europe and Asia and whatever. And secondly, after post-industrial revolution, that now it's not about exchanging grain for manufactured goods, but the economy is structured differently. And there is globalization as an alternative project of integration and erosion of nation states, and we can continue. So what all these recent developments change in this theory? Thank you.
So my point, I'll answer your question, but my point is that if we want to make sense of where Europe is right now, we have to get the last century right. And what we tend to do, not just Europeans, Americans love this too, is we take these round anniversaries and we commemorate, but the every 10 years or every 25 years or every 100 years allows us to draw these beautiful circles, but the circles are empty in the middle. They don't contain the things that they need to contain for us to see the history, the substance of the history as it really was. And so I'm trying to work against that. I'm trying to put into that circle the categories of analysis that I think are really important, like, for example, empire, and like, for example, decolonization. Now, this brings me to what I want to say about your question, which is that the Europe that we have now is a post-imperial Europe. If we get that straight, we have some chance to create a post-imperial Europe or some other kind of Europe. But if we don't get it straight, if we think that Europe is a matter of the free choices of already existing nation states, then we don't have any chance of dealing with precisely the kinds of problems that you're talking about. So I don't think that this logic is superseded by the fact we're in 2018. On the contrary, I think there's a whole raft of issues, and you named some of them, which make a whole lot more sense if we're able to break the line between European and global history. This is one of my personal obsessions, is that we tell European history as though it's about Europe, and then we teach colonial history as though it's about the rest of the world, which just doesn't make any sense. I mean, anti-colonialism, at least as I see it, begins in the Balkans in the early 19th century. The history of empire has to include Ukraine, which is one of the most thoroughly colonized bits of the world. I mean, in the history of the world, one of the most intensely colonized parts, however you want to define colonization. And so my view is that if we can break down the barrier between European and colonial history, then European history makes sense and European problems also make more sense. Migration is the completely obvious example of all of this. If we think of European history as happening in Europe, then all these people, of course, are coming from other places that we don't know anything about. We didn't have anything to do with the creation of Syria, or, and so the whole migration story, it's not that it solves the migration problem, but it makes the migration problem at least make a lot more sense. Now, the other thing I wanted to say is that if we get straight what Europe is, if we see it as a post-imperial political solution, then we can ask post-imperial political solution for what? Because the way the debate is currently framed is Europe is a problem, right? Europe's a problem for me because I want to be Czech or Polish or Hungarian or English or whatever. So the debate is currently framed Europe's a problem. But what if we started the debate from Europe was a solution? Because see, Europe was a solution to the problem of globalization. The problem of globalization in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, from a European point of view, was the problem of decolonization. That was globalization. The fact that other people had set up states too on what used to be your imperial territory. That was globalization. That you didn't get to set the terms of trade unilaterally anymore in the world. From the British point of view, that's globalization. So Europe is an answer to globalization. And now, as globalization changes, the question is, how can Europe continue to be an answer to the challenges of globalization? I mentioned some of these, but I'll mention them again. Cyber. I mean, one of the most obvious examples of our 21st century globalization is the fact that the majority of the world's population now uses the same information system, and that we are now vulnerable to political signals coming from all over the world. Much of what people read here in the Czech Republic every day over the internet is placed in front of them by foreign powers who are consciously trying to, as you very well know, influence debate in a certain direction in this country. How do you deal with that? Nation states are not going to deal with that very well. Even a very big nation state like the United States might have problems with that. But interestingly, Europe has done reasonably well. I mean, not perfectly well, but Europe has done reasonably well. What about climate? Climate is the globalization of the 20th century. It's the hangover of 20th century globalization. 20th century globalization was carbon-based. Climate change is the hangover of that. Europe is dealing with that reasonably well. So, I mean, what I would say is that if we see Europe as an answer as opposed to a problem, then we can ask, can it keep answering challenges of globalization? That's how I would see it.
Thanks. Let's have now the question here in the front.
James Mensch, I'm a professor at Charles University. I guess I'm wondering about what the idea of Europe is that is being presupposed in all this conversation. Is it some shared past? Because, you know, the histories of Western Europe and Eastern Europe are very different. Or is it some idea of the future? I mean, can you clarify what's the notion of Europe that's leading your thought?
So thank you for that question. What I'm trying very hard to do is not propose an idea of Europe, but reveal the current idea of Europe for what it is, which is a misunderstanding. So the current idea of Europe as I grasp it, and I could be mistaken, but the current idea of Europe as I grasp it is that Europe is a common narrative which assembles a certain lowest common denominator of essentially false national histories. And the lowest common denominator is we all exist as nations, we're all very old, and we've all learned something from the recent past which has to do about violence and the fact that economics is an answer to violence. That's the Europe that currently exists, or that's the discourse of Europe that currently exists. I make that as an observation. Could be correct, could be incorrect. I'm not using it as a tool of analysis, right? Because for me, what we are actually looking at is a continent whose center of gravity was beyond itself for almost all of modern history, and whose center of gravity, economically, politically, only lands on itself after this 3-century or so interlude in the second half of the 20th century with this project of European integration. So for me, I mean, there's a British Empire, there's a Dutch Empire, French Empire, Belgian Empire, but it's not meaningful. That's world history or something, but it's not really Europe. It's not European history. There isn't a Europe in the sense of a political unit you can draw lines on, which has something to do with geographical Europe until, you know, very late in the day, until the second half of the 20th century. So I'm trying very hard not to presuppose anything. I'm trying to observe a certain discourse. I'm trying to say what the discourse has wrong, you know, in the service of trying to get the history right, or at least conceptually to make history possible and make political discussions more fruitful. That's what I'm trying to do.
Thank you. Unfortunately, our time is up. But before we continue this conversation over a glass of wine served in the foyer, to which you all are cordially invited, let me say a few words of thanks. So first, thanks, Minister Petříček, for hosting us here today. Madam Rector, thank you for making this event possible, and I truly hope on behalf of the Institute of International Relations that this is just the first step in a very productive cooperation that we will have in the future. Thank you, Tim Snyder, for your inspiring lecture, and thank you all for being here today and for your attention.